At the height of the Cold War, Captain Francis Gary Powers piloted the highly classified U-2 spy plane on a top-secret espionage mission over the Chelyabinsk-65 plutonium production facility deep within the Soviet Union. The U-2 was designed to fly at altitudes the Soviets would be unable to detect via radar, which seemed to be the case ever since the CIA began espionage operations over the USSR in 1958. But, more than 1,300 miles into Soviet territory, the Soviets managed to hit the aircraft with a surface-to-air missile. This incident sprung into action an enormous cover-up by the Americans, led by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The extent to which it failed, however, would cause one of the greatest political embarrassments in modern history. Following World War II, the US government recognized a need for aerial reconnaissance over the Soviet Union, a very dangerous proposition as any indications to the Soviets of such a program would increase the already strained diplomatic relations between the two countries. The US government began accepting proposals for aircraft that met a very specific list of requirements. It had to have a small radar cross-signature, carry the payload of highly specialized camera equipment, and fly above 65,000 feet, the altitude limit of Soviet radar systems as determined by US intelligence. The CIA solicited these proposals from small aircraft manufacturers, as they preferred a company who could devote their entire focus to this project. Catching wind of this, major aircraft manufacturer Lockheed submitted an unsolicited proposal for what was essentially a jet-powered sailplane. Enter Project Aquatone, the development codename given to the aircraft later ambiguously named the U-2. The project would be headquartered at Groom Lake in Nevada, now known as Area 51. The base was established for Aquatone, as the dry lake bed and extreme seclusion proved perfect for smooth landings and maintained the secrecy surrounding the project. Test flights began at Area 51 in 1955, with direction coming from President Eisenhower to start operations over the Soviet Union as soon as possible. Under the cover story of, quote, weather research, the U-2 began operations over Europe in June 1956. Eisenhower remained concerned of possible radar detection by the Soviets, which was only made worse when it appeared that the aircraft had been tracked on an early mission over East Germany. But, with mounting pressure over the lack of intelligence surrounding the Soviet development of nuclear weapons, Eisenhower approved the first U-2 flights over the Soviet Union to begin on July 4, 1956. Over the following few days, U-2 missions captured images of key targets in Leningrad, Kaliningrad, Moscow, and even Russian fighters attempting and failing to intercept the U-2s. This proved that although the Soviets could track the U-2s, at least in some form, they did not have the technological ability to intercept them. The CIA knew, though, that it would only be a matter of time before the Soviets would find a way to shoot down a U-2. With that seen as an almost foregone conclusion, they turned their attention to what would become the successor to the U-2 program, Project Oxcart. Oxcart would not come soon enough, though, as in 1960, the Soviets would finally score a hit against a U-2 flying in their airspace. It was May 1st, 1960. Almost 2 years since U-2 reconnaissance missions began over Soviet airspace. By now, the Soviets were well aware of the existence of these missions and grew to expect their presence. Captain Francis Gary Powers piloted his U-2 with the mission to photograph top-secret targets, including a plutonium production facility in the Western Soviet Union. When his plane was detected, Lieutenant General of the Soviet Air Force, Yevgeny Savitsky, placed all of the air unit commanders in the area on red alert and ordered them to, quote, attack the violator by all alert flights located in the area of the foreign plane's course, and to ram if necessary. Finally, the Soviets would score a hit on a U-2 via a surface-to-air missile. Powers was able to eject from his plane, and after a scare attempting to disconnect from his air hose, he parachuted to safety below, and completely unbeknownst to the Americans, he was captured by the Soviets. Fearing war if the Soviets learned of the true purpose behind the U-2 missions, Eisenhower and the CIA began an extensive cover-up operation. Assuming Powers dead, either as a result of the crash or suicide upon capture as ordered, and also assuming the U-2 destroyed, the government immediately fabricated a cover story. On May 5th, NASA released a press release, asserting that a weather research plane had gone missing over Turkey. They explained that the pilot radioed having problems with his oxygen supply, which resulted in him going unconscious. From there, the plane flew on autopilot until fuel ran out somewhere in the Soviet Union. The CIA even hurriedly painted a U-2 in NASA colors and released a picture to the press, adding credibility to the story. This complicated potential relations between the US and the Soviet Union, as a summit between the two nations was scheduled in Paris just days after the incident. Eisenhower knew that if he took responsibility for the crash in Soviet airspace, it could complicate or cancel the summit entirely and further sour relations with the Soviets. On the other hand, he could claim he wasn't aware of the flight and project to the world an inability to run his own administration. He chose the latter option in an attempt to ensure the summit would go on. Unknown to the Americans, Khrushchev had the wreckage and the pilot and knew the true nature of the U-2 missions. He decided to publicly announce that they'd taken possession of the aircraft, but intentionally left out any detail about the pilot. Upon hearing this, the Americans reaffirmed their story. The pilot of a weather research plane lost consciousness over Turkey, and the aircraft went down in Soviet airspace. Then, on May 7th, Khrushchev announced to the world, "I must tell you a secret. When I made my first report, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well. And now just look at all the silly things the Americans have said." In his announcement, Khrushchev showed the world wreckage of the U-2, much of which was still intact. He even showed developed photography from the U-2, giving absolute proof of the American cover-up. Khrushchev didn't immediately blame Eisenhower, though, and what could be assumed as Khrushchev either attempting to preserve the pending Paris summit or him believing Eisenhower's denial of involvement, Khrushchev called out Director of the CIA Alan Dulles, asking for an explanation. Eisenhower was utterly defeated. In direct response to Khrushchev's call on CIA Director Dulles to answer to what had happened, Eisenhower's only alleged words to his secretary were, "I would like to resign." Captain Francis Gary Powers was convicted of espionage by the Soviet Union and was sentenced to 10 years confinement. He was supposedly treated quite well by his captors and was released in a prisoner exchange in February of 1962. As a result of the incident over the Soviet Union in 1960, flyovers of Soviet territory were deemed too dangerous, even for the U-2 successor, Project Oxcart. We'll get into those files in another video.